keep doing daily videos on YouTube, I need to raise my Patreon and Subscribe Star income to a grand total of $200 a month. So if you're so inclined, help a chap out. Zang. Hello lovelies, I have some great role-playing game advice to dole out from my lofty perch. So, listen up.
Because it's going to be very intelligent and quite interesting and humane.
Now, contrary to what you might think, I don't actually have a huge ego. I pretend to have one on TV for the lulz. But in my recent appearances on various streams and from Tabletopless, where the gang there seemed to like the way that I games master and do things.
An interesting girl. I think she found it rather enjoyable.
In regards to all that, people seem to think that I have some particular talent or knack. I can't particularly say that I see myself that way. I don't think there's anything special about me. But still, if you feel the urge to games master in the way that I do, maybe there's some things that you can do in the same way that I do, with a little bit of practice and effort to get where I am.
How'd you get up there? Wasn't easy!
Look, I dabble in a lot of different creative enterprises, but being a good games master is very much its own thing. It's very different from being a good writer or an actor of any kind, or really any other form of storytelling whatsoever. There are aspects from these other things that you might or might not do which are transferable, but being a good games master often has its own little tweaks and quirks, violates principles of good storytelling in other contexts. But there are things also that you can take and you can bring across, like a good vocabulary from being a writer, for example, voice acting and confidence from being an actor. You can bring those into a game, but the game's still something very different. There are definitely unique aspects to being a good GM, to playing a good RPG. People come to your table with certain expectations.
Excitement and adventure and really wild things.
But here's one dirty little secret to role-playing games that's very simple. A lot of game sort of stories are stolen, plagiarized, inspired by, nudge wink, and pay homage, nudge wink, to other stories, TV series, films, whatever. You can rip off a couple of things and mix them together, and it can be just as satisfying as an entirely newly crafted story. In fact, a lot of B-movie bad film ideas can be the most satisfying and amazing tabletop adventures just by that shift in context and the opportunity to explore it more and improvise around it more, to improve on what you've seen in the original. But when it comes to a game, it's much more about the delivery and the scope for people to play and experience their characters than it is necessarily the plot. A very hackneyed plot can do very well. A plot that doesn't even really necessarily make any internal sense can work very well. Nobody really expects the kind of polished, tightly plotted, A-list Hollywood feature or production values from a tabletop game. They don't expect the tight plotting, the decent voice acting and so on. Or at least they didn't before Critical Role.
Bring me the boar worms.
So look, you can get away with really simple, hackneyed, worn-out stories in the tabletop gaming space. Plus it's just you, not a team of writers, producing a story each week or however often it is you play. So long as you present that well, so long as you keep the pace snapping along and you make sure that everyone's engaged in what's going on, then, much like Easter eggs in Marvel films, many players will actually enjoy spotting what you've nicked from other sources. will enjoy calling you out for it, but not in a bad way, in a good way. Or maybe they'll just welcome the opportunity to inhabit and play their characters for a while, regardless of anything else that's going on. Maybe the story is just there as an excuse to hang out and get up to shenanigans as their characters. So don't get hung up on some sort of complicated Oscar-winning story unless it's for your own personal enjoyment. Think like Roger Corman. Good enough, and move on.
Boy being meets girl being beneath the silvery moon, which then explodes for no adequately explored reason.
So then, how can you become a fantastic, breathtaking, handsome, huge, schlonged games master like Grimm? Well, I would say the first thing you need to do is to become game literate.
You fools! He's playing some barbaric game. Now match him! Like this! Now!
Oranges are not the only fruit. Dungeons and Dragons, or The Dark Eye, I guess, if you're German, is not the only game that's available. And the more games that you've read, learned, and played, the more perspectives you have that you can bring to your own game, the better able you are to adapt to situations and problems in the game that you are running, whatever they might be. Whether it's one of these games or not, you can take lessons from one game and transfer them into another. It can even inspire house rules at your own table. There's more out there than D&D, certainly, and you'll only benefit from learning more about all of these different games, especially if you want to move from games mastering into creating your own games. Then being well read in the oeuvre is probably something worth doing. Second, you are not a storyteller, even in games where they call the games master a storyteller. You are there to facilitate the stories of the players, of which you are one, fair enough, but if you try to force them to follow your story or plot exactly, then the game will become clunky and the sense of player choice and freedom will vanish. Despite this, the third point is that you are the final arbiter, referee. The buck stops with you, right? Don't be a dick about it. Let people petition you to change your mind, but recognize that fact that at the end of the day, the buck has to stop with you. A lot of the more modern narrative-oriented games give players specific rules that allow them to change the world through the expenditure of tokens, that allow them to change the narrative and the circumstances as you go along. And this is the death of a lot of games. But too many players seem to have bought into this idea that they can veto anything that goes on at the table, that they can force you to change anything that goes on at the table.
I must apologize for Wimp Low. He is an idiot. We have purposely trained him wrong, as a joke.
There's a lot of talk about changing the term for Games Master or Dungeon Master into something else, but all the alternatives that I've seen so far seem to be worse or are predicated upon a particular reading of the term master as being sexist or harkening back to slavery or something, which is absurd and insane. It just means someone skilled at a particular craft. Narrator, referee, storyteller, these all create wrong impressions and encourage the wrong kind of behaviour in the Games Master at the table, some of which we've touched on earlier. Games Master and Dungeon Master work, even Keeper works and seems to fit far better. Now, a good Games Master will give players buy-in to the campaign anyway through their character backgrounds or talking with them, what do you want to see in the game, what things would you like to see explored, is there anything I'm doing that you don't like or would like me to change. A good Games Master will do that anyway. The explicit mechanics are unnecessary. It's not something that needs to be formalized, and even within low complexity systems, and even if you are a Games Master with an improvisational style such as I have, suddenly changing tack from players using the rules to buy in and change something, alter the context and so on, that can still throw you, and it makes the game more difficult to run, despite, generally speaking, narrative games being more simple in terms of system. It creates a struggle, it creates frustration and conflict in a way that is unnecessary when players are allowed to just flange your game whenever they want to.
Now, this really pisses me off to no end.
Fourthly, I would say that you have to understand that the rules as written, the books, even in more formal, more crunchy, more rules heavy, more technical games, even then the books are not the be all and end all of absolutely everything in the game.
The code is more what you'd call guidelines than actual rules.
More important than getting the rules interpretation exactly right, finding the right page, reading it through, comprehending it, applying it, it's far more important to keep the game moving forward, to keep the pace going, and that's especially true in combat, which is where all games tend to get bogged down. So it's more important to keep the mood, to keep the feel, to keep the pace running than it is to get that exact correct ruling going. If you can get it right, then do, but otherwise just make a temporary on-the-fly ruling and let the game roll on rather than have it get stuck.
I'd far rather be happy than right any day.
And are you?
No. That's where it all falls down, of course.
You can always make a note and look it up later if it really worries you that much. That is an option. Fifthly, I would say make things easier for yourself with shortcuts and game hacks. Bookmark your book, just not too much, otherwise you end up bookmarking every page and then it's no help whatsoever. Post-it notes and stick up wherever it is that you're playing, or in your book or on your GM screen, the rules that you're always having trouble with, always having issues with. The same way that we all have weak points with spelling, there's certain words that we never get right, there will be rules that you never quite get right. So having an additional reminder around to look at is really helpful in that way. Recruit players to make your life easier. Have them get their own copies of the book so they can look things up for you or before their turn. Have them bullet point their novel of a character background so that you can separate out, so that you can pass out the things that you actually need to know that might actually come up in the game, like what magic college they went to, how many siblings they have, who their parents are, who their arch nemesis is, rather than having to pore over this whole ream of purple prose to pick out the salient points that you might actually need at some point. Have little sets of rules outside of the game rules, reminders, things that work to make the game a little bit better. Have a note to remind you to ignore the writer's advice of show don't tell, because that doesn't really work in a tabletop gaming setting. It just doesn't. You don't have the time. You've got multiple points of view, so the third person omniscient actually works in tabletop games. And if you're deliberately constricting the amount of information, it just slows up play, and
Ain't nobody got time for that.
Ultimately, what makes it work, more than any amount of advice or little rules or ways of going about things, is practice, and I would say game literacy in multiple games. You find your own style, you practice, and much of that is independent of any particular game system. It's about keeping up the pace, it's about learning how to effectively and efficiently describe things. It's about making things easy for yourself and learning to adapt and rule on the fly without feeling that you have to refer to the books necessarily, just to keep that snap, 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 snap pace going. Are you having any issues with your games, or would you like any hints or tips or advice that's more specific, or a particular problem that you're having with your games? Comment below or message me on Twitter or other social media, and I'll try to get to giving you some more specific advice and help and and hoping it's useful in a later video. Zang.
Aren't you a little tired of so-called horror media about shiny, sparkly, angsty, whiny monsters? I know I am, and that's why I created Actual Fucking Monsters, where you will play an actual fucking monster doing horrible and monstrous things and being tracked down and killed for it. Buy now at DriveThruRPG, post-mort.com or lulu.com.
Well, I look at it myself as the beginning, really, of an exploration. That's the reason we're exploring. You don't know what you'll run into on an exploration. What the sky looks like, what the stars look like. Do they still twinkle, or are they a steady light when you get outside the atmosphere?